Waiting for Dan. That's good. Hi, everybody. Welcome to today's IRES seminar. Today, as was the case last week, and all the minutes in between, at least for me, we're gathered on the unceded, ancestral, and traditional territory of the Musqueam people. And to me, this land acknowledgement is a reminder to continue learning about the history of the land. In particular, I think a lot about the history of the legal disputes and legal settlements, learning about places of cultural importance, especially beyond the reserve land. I was learning a year back about an area south of Reg Beach that is traditionally used as a hunting ground, but outside of the reserve land. And so a place of sort of contentious multiple uses. And also continue reflecting for myself about my relationship with the land and realizing recently in one of the Indigenous Justice Brown Bag discussions that I do have a different behavior on reserve land and non-reserve land, and where does that come from? What does that mean? And yeah, challenging that in a way. And I want to now introduce our speaker for today, David Tindall. David comes to us from the Department of Sociology at UBC. And he received his PhD in sociology at the University of Toronto. And his research looks a lot at many sociological aspects of contentious environmental issues like climate change, forestry, fisheries, and in particular at engagement in environmental action, participation in environmental movements, and how this is shaped by social networks, both virtual and non-virtual networks, how it is shaped by social values, attitudes, discourses, media coverage, and how those impacts last over time as well. Please join me in welcoming David. We look forward to your seminar today.
So thank you very much for the nice introduction, and thanks also very much for the invitation to speak. It's always nice to get invited to these types of things. I have quite a bit of material. So what I'm going to suggest is if folks have questions, if it's a clarifying question, go ahead and ask, but otherwise leave questions to the end, just so I can get through the material that I'm working on here. Oh, we got a little problem here. There we go. So today I'm going to talk on a study I've been working on with some colleagues on climate change policy networks. In terms of research, my day job, so to speak, is looking at networks and micro mobilization in social movements, in particular around environment and climate change. And this is kind of a second line of research, which kind of methodologically is kind of a step up, mostly looking at organizations, but looking at how organizations interact over climate change policy. And the sort of underlying idea is that by doing social network analysis of the relationships amongst organizations that are involved in climate change policy making, we can add something to the explanation beyond just looking at the attributes of the actors, such as, for example, the sector that they're in. So the study draws upon a few different things. I'm not going to go into all of it in detail, but it draws upon some key concepts and explanatory ideas in the broader field of social networks and social network analysis, and more specifically on some ideas in what's called the policy networks literature. Now, it's probably worth saying a few things about network analysis, because it's perhaps not as familiar to everyone, and I'm happy in the Q&A to say a few more details about this. A distinction is often made in the literature between what's called whole networks and ego networks. And so the idea of whole networks is that you look at all of the relationships amongst all of the actors in a bounded social network. Ego network analysis looks at ties that radiate out from particular individuals, and sometimes the ties amongst the alters of that individual. So I'm going to give you a couple of slides demonstrating that. The other distinction that's useful to think about here is that in social network analysis, there's a difference between what are called one-mode networks and two-mode networks. So one-mode networks are situations, say if you have a graph, the actors in the column and actors in the rows are all the same actors, and you're just looking at ties amongst all of the actors. In two-mode network analysis, usually the actors in the row are different than the actors in the column in a matrix, and this hopefully will become a little bit more apparent with an illustration. But what we do in this study is we take an ego network approach, and then we kind of do a hybrid approach between one mode and two mode types of network analysis. So this is a graph of a juvenile gang. This is an example of a whole network. It looks at all the ties amongst everyone who were in this gang. And this is an example of an ego network. Here we have Ben in the middle. If you kind of go back, you can kind of see Ben here. With the ego network, we've pulled out Ben and the alters that Ben is tied to and the ties amongst them. Visualization of the one mode versus two mode idea. Again, here's the juvenile gang. This would be an example of a one mode network. Here, by contrast, is the two mode network. In the red nodes, we have a bunch of individuals, and in the blue nodes, we have organizations. So we're kind of interested in the extent to which individuals are connected to each other indirectly through organizations, for example. So in this particular analysis, as I mentioned, we take a hybrid approach, and we did kind of a version of this type of method in a paper, which is cited there, but on a somewhat different topic. So a core idea in social network analysis, but also for this study in particular, is the notion of centrality, the idea that some actors are more central than other actors, and being central in a network can have consequences. So for example, you might be more informed about issues, you might have a greater potential to influence other actors, and there's other sorts of things that can be a consequence of having greater centrality as well. There's a variety of different types of centrality measures, which try to tap into different kind of nuances of what the concept of centrality means. But in this study, we're going to look at two specific measures. One is the most basic measure of centrality, which is referred to as degree centrality, which is the total number of ties an actor has. The other type of centrality is called eigenvector centrality. And the notion behind this concept is that actors are more or less central depending on the extent to which they're tied to alters who are more central in the network. And technically speaking, we use a two-mode version of these measures of centrality. So as I said, one of the sources for this study is the policy network perspective, which is kind of a subset of a broader category of research that's referred to as political networks. The idea of policy networks is that scholars look at the different actors that are involved in policy making and their interactions in various ways, such as communication and collaboration. And one of the ideas is that by having a better sense of the location of actors in the network, we can get this reveals certain things, such as the relative influence of different actors, or the likelihood of certain types of policy outcomes happening depending on the relative prominence of certain actors in the network. The organizations in the network I'm studying can be all kinds of different types of actors, such as government actors, researchers, people in think tanks, and so on. So this is a graph of a kind of policy network. This is based on some of the data that we collected, although not the analysis that we're doing today. But in this particular analysis, we identified 4 categories of actors that are coded in different colors here. We have a bunch of lines which represent ties amongst the actors in the network. And in this particular network, what we did is we asked a question about the extent to which the organizations that respondents were associated with supported curtailing oil sands development in Canada. And so the more support they had for curtailing oil sands development, the larger their node is. And if they're on the other side of this question, the smaller their node is. So, kind of one easy to see thing is you can see the nodes for environmental groups are a lot bigger than the nodes for business organizations. So the core outcome that I'm trying to look at in this study is influence, or more particularly perceived influence. Now, a lot of scholars in the policy network literature focus on blocks or other kinds of subgroups. In this analysis, we're gonna focus on individual actors in terms of nodes, although I'm going to also use some categories to describe them. Because this is the main thing I'm looking at, perceived influence, it's worth talking a little bit more about what influence could mean in the context of this type of research. So one way influence can occur is just in a kind of passive way, just through providing information, through talking to people, giving speeches, doing interviews, doing posts on social media, and so on, even distributing scientific information. And this might affect things in terms of changing public opinions and so on. But there's a number of other ways in which influence can come into play. So one is kind of more active, when actors are involved in actively trying to persuade other actors of a particular position. Another way in which influence comes into play is through exchanges. So sometimes in policy networks, one actor agrees to support another actor's policy preference based on some kind of quid pro quo type of notion. Another way influence might occur is through sanctions of some sort, right? So sometimes there'll be, efforts made by policy actors to cajole other actors into adopting a particular policy position, and maybe veiled threats of something like boycotting the other actor or providing some kind of other external or negative external pressure on the other actor. It's also useful to think a little bit about influence of what. So what is it that we're trying to make sense of? And there's a number of possibilities. So actors can have influence on discourse. So for instance, the content of policy ideas. They can have influence on other actors in terms of beliefs, policy positions, and perhaps actions. They can influence the shape of policy options, and they can influence policy outcomes, what policies get adopted and what policies get implemented. So as I said, the key outcome here is perceived influence, and we're focusing on two types of perceived influence. One is being influential in domestic climate change politics and being influential on the respondents' organizations' policy position. So we're going to try to explain these two different outcome variables. Now, sometimes I get the question, well, who cares about perceived influence? What we really should be interested in is real influence or objective influence. And there's some discussion of this in the literature, but a number of commentators have said that, in fact, perceived influence, for several reasons, is a pretty good approximation of real influence. So the case I focus on here is Canada. This is part of a larger international comparative project. I'm not going to talk about the other country cases here, but kind of the general idea underlying the larger project is to focus on comparative analyses. The data that we collected mostly in 2015, before the Trudeau Liberal government was initially elected, and just before the Paris Agreement, which happened a little bit later on in 2015. Now here, partly to save time, I'm going to assume that people in the room here are pretty familiar with Canada's record, so I'm not going to go into this in too much detail, but I would summarize it as something like this: that at least under the Liberal federal government, Canada talks a pretty good game on climate change, not so much for the previous Conservative government. But we continue to be a poor performer. We're in fact one of the worst performers on climate change measures, certainly in the Western world. And you know, despite some of the initiatives that the Liberal government has taken more recently. So I have three general research questions that motivate the study, and then I have some hypotheses. There's one pair in particular I'm going to emphasize, and then kind of go more quickly over some of the other ones. But a general question that I'm interested in here is, how is social network centrality associated with perceived influence in climate change policy? And kind of drilling down a little further, what relations are important for explaining perceived influence in climate policy? So we have three relations that we're going to look at: communication, so how often people communicate with others and who they communicate with; collaboration, so the extent to which other actors collaborate with the respondents' organization; and sharing of scientific of expert information. So those are the three relations we're going to look at and think a little bit about, what's the relative importance of those different relations. And then I'm also interested in some of the non-network variables. So how is the sector background of actors related to their perceived influence in climate policy? So maybe I'll just pause there quickly and see, does anyone have any questions or need anything clarified at the moment? Yes. Yeah. Yeah, so I guess, to a certain extent, sharing of expertise or even collaboration involves some kind of communication. We ask separate questions. So we ask about, how often do you communicate with, does your organization communicate with X? So we have a separate question about that, but we also look at, we control for whether or not the other actor is involved in information sharing or with collaboration, and we try to look at the effect for communication, kind of controlling for information sharing and for collaboration. So just going to move the little red arrow there. The two main hypotheses, and I have pairs of hypotheses because we have two outcome variables here. The first is social network centrality is measured by eigenvector centrality in the communication network is positively associated with perceived influence in domestic climate politics. So in other words, the more central an actor is, the more influential they're going to be perceived to be. And the same sort of idea, but hypothesis two is the same sort of idea, but focusing on the respondents' organization's policy position, right? So, is centrality correlated with domestic climate politics in general? Is communication associated with the organization's policy position? We ask the same kind of structure of hypotheses for the collaboration network for both of these outcomes. And then we ask the same hypothesis for the scientific sharing network, scientific information sharing network. Theoretically, we're kind of more or less just focused on the network variables here in this analysis. But seeing as we're at a research institution and there's lots of researchers in the crowd, there's another hypothesis that we decided to explore a little bit, and that is the status of being a researcher, either as an individual or as an organization. What is this, to what extent is the status of being a researcher associated with perceived influence? And in fact, we kind of go a step further and we assert, that being a researcher, being a research organization is going to be positively associated with perceived influence. But again, as I noted, this is kind of more of a secondary hypothesis. So this is part of a larger project, which is referred to as COMPON. That is an acronym for Comparing Climate Change Policy Networks. And if you're interested in more information, you can look at the URL here, www.compon.org, and there's a variety of references and other sorts of things there. There's about 20 countries, or maybe a bit more now, that are involved in this project, and a lot of papers that compare different countries. And there's a quick screenshot of the COMPON website. So for the Canadian case, we did a variety of things. So we started it off with media content analysis of national newspapers in Canada and their coverage of climate change issues, and we've published a bunch of papers on that using what's called discourse network analysis. For the analysis I'm going to talk about today, I'm going to talk a little bit about the sampling strategy, so I'll kind of loop back to that in a second. But the second phase of the project involved interviews. So we did interviews with about 80 representatives of organizations involved in climate change policymaking in Canada. A lot of these interviews were fairly lengthy, up to about an hour or so. We did qualitative thematic coding of the verbatim transcripts using NVivo as a tool. And then we sent invitations to the interview respondents to participate in a mostly closed-ended online questionnaire. And it was the questionnaire phase is where we collected the social network data. For the sampling strategy, we tried to get a representative sample using particular techniques. So what we wanted was kind of the top set of individuals that were most prominent in terms of some factors in terms of climate change policy interactions and discourse and so on. So some of the criteria we used in our sampling strategy was whether or not actors had participated in COP, whether they had participated in testimony about climate bills, whether or not they had participated in something that used to be around called the National Roundtable on the Environment and Economy, and whether or not they had appeared in newspaper coverage in the Globe and Mail and National Post. And so we looked at this set of criteria for identifying organizational actors that we wanted to include in our sample. For the network questions, we have two questions, which are kind of networky questions on perception, which I've already talked about. And then we had three questions about interactions around communication, sharing scientific advice, and climate and domestic climate change politics. And so what we do with the respondents, representatives of the organizations, we ask them about a set of target actors. The target actors involve all of the organizations that were in the sample, plus some additional ones. So we added additional target actors based on our our expert judgment from being immersed in this stuff and doing media analyses and so on. And so we added additional actors, in particular, and this is something that's a little bit different from most of the work in this area. We added prominent individuals. So there's some prominent individuals that are important in the climate change policy network in Canada. So we asked about people's ties to these prominent individuals. And another thing that we did is we asked about ties to media nodes. So in the policy network literature, people pay some attention to media, but they don't tend to pay attention to media as actors. They tend to pay attention to media as a source of data, right? So in the sense that, oh, the media said such and such, and they just use that as kind of data on maybe a politician or something like that. But here we actually treat media workers and media outlets as actors in the social network and ask questions about that. So we end up with two mode matrices of 44 respondents by 171 targets. We calculate measures of centrality, and then basically we flip things. And so we end up with 171 actors based on the centrality of the targets. And so here's a quick visualization of that data for the communication network. Might be a bit hard to see kind of further back in the room, but the little red nodes are the actual respondents in the survey. And the blue nodes are the various targets, organizations, and individuals. And here the blue nodes are sized by how central they are in the network. Now, one thing that I will say here, or a couple of things I will say here, my title is a little bit of false advertising, because it sounded like I was going to tell you exactly who was most influential in the Canadian Climate Change Policy Network, which I actually know the answer to that. But what we decided to do for this study was to keep the identities of actors confidential for a variety of reasons. In particular, a number of folks that we wanted to talk to just said, "There's no way we're talking to you, if we're identified in this study." It's fairly typical in social science research to keep the identity of respondents anonymous. So that's not too unusual. But what was kind of unusual is it was unusual in the context of this comparative project. So my European colleagues kept saying, "What? You're not putting like the names of these organizations and individuals in your graphs? Like, why not?" And apparently there's a big difference between Europe and North America on this topic. But this was quite sensitive. And in fact, there were some representatives of environmental organizations that were really concerned because during this period, there was a crackdown by the Harper government on ENGOs through the Canadian Revenue Agency and so on, and they didn't want to be on the record as saying certain types of things, or having people be able to map their relationships with other organizations and stuff. So it was quite sensitive. So we have these two measures of centrality, which I've explained already, so I'll quickly go over that. We have the two dependent variables, influence in climate change politics and influence on respondents' organizations' policy position. And then we have a set of independent variables. The main independent variables are the three network relations that I have already mentioned. But then we have a set of control variables, and often social network researchers refer to these types of variables as attribute variables because they're attributes of the actors. They're non-network attributes of the actors. So we coded actors for whether or not, for what sector they're in: business, civil society, media, think tank, research. We split researchers into individuals and organizations. We have kind of a grab-all category of other, and we have government. So we use government as the reference category in the regression analyses. We also were interested in whether the targets were individuals or organizations. As I mentioned, this is kind of a bit of a innovation for this study, because usually in this type of study, just organizations are looked at. And then we also looked at whether or not the entity, the actor, operated at the federal, national level, or were at some other sort of level, provincial level or local level or something like that. And so we look at the extent to which these control variables are associated with the outcome variables we're interested in. So just to kind of give you a little bit of a taste of the data, a couple of quick bar graphs. This is for the top 30 actors, the prevalence of certain categories of actors in terms of perceived influence. So you can see here the actor that's seen, the category of actor that's seen as being most influential is government, right? And that shouldn't be too surprising, because governments are kind of inherently involved in policy making at the national level. The next two categories are business and then media. And then we also have a similar type of bar graph for the top 30 actors in terms of their centrality in terms of communication. Again, government is the most central actor. Interestingly, media is the second most central actor. And this is kind of interesting for a variety of reasons, but amongst others that most researchers in this area don't pay attention to this particular actor as having agency. And then here we can see research. Well, researchers are not very central compared to other actors, but they're not even in the top 30 categories in terms of influence. So, we're seeing already some signs that researchers are not seen as being very influential. So I have a couple of well, I have a bunch of regression tables here, but I'm just going to quickly go over them. Probably you won't be able to see them at the back of the room, but I'll explain the punchlines. Okay, so I have not much time left, but I think I can kind of wrap this up pretty quickly. So the first regression starts off with the control variables. It then, which is model 1, it then adds, maybe I'll just skip to the last model. It then adds actor as a source of expert information, actor collaborates with IRES organization, and actor communicates with IRES organization, centrality scores for that. So what we find is that in the full model, there's a positive and significant effect for communication. In fact, it's the strongest effect here. There's also an effect for collaboration, which is fairly reasonable. There's no effect for the actor as a source of expert information. And one thing that's kind of interesting is if we look at the effect for researchers, we find it's significant and it's negative. So if you're a research organization, then in the Climate Change Policy Network, you actually have less influence than other actors do, controlling for all of these other things. We have another regression where we just look at communication just to try to see if that effect holds when we only have one of the relations here, in case there's multicollinearity or something. And we basically find the same results. The correlation or the regression coefficient is even stronger. These are all standardized regression coefficients. By the way, if you look at the R squares for these tables by social science standards, these are quite high R squares. So we're explaining quite a lot of the variation in the outcome. And then very quickly, we do the same sort of thing for the variable for influence on the respondent's organization. We find the same general pattern with one important distinction, and that is collaboration is actually more important for influence on the respondent's organization than communication is, but there's still an effect for communication. Again, sharing, being a source of expert information doesn't matter. And again, we have this big whopping negative effect for being a researcher. So being a researcher is not helpful if you're trying to affect climate change policy outcomes. We do the same thing, removing two of the network relations, and we then find that communication has a pretty strong effect. Kind of generally speaking, we find that there's a strong impact of being central in the communication network on perceived influence, both in general and on terms of respondents' organization. It's interesting in particular that this holds even when we control for some other things like centrality in the collaboration network and centrality in terms of sharing scientific information. So there does seem to be a distinct communication effect. Our argument kind of more generally is that by understanding network centrality and some of these processes, this might help us get a better handle on some of the climate change policy outcomes that we've seen thus far. And I have a few additional things I can add to that in the Q&A. And perhaps for folks who are researchers out there in the crowd, it might be better for you to go into politics or into business or something like that if you're trying to influence climate change policy outcomes. And I'll just stop there and take some questions.
A little over about 12 or so minutes per question.
Fernando.
Hello, Evan. Long time no see. Evan and I are good old friends on the Climate Rally project. So, looking at kind of everything we've seen on social movements, I guess you and I have been involved in really too fast. What do you think is? I think we've seen this fracturing of a lot of groups, particularly during COVID on social media and influencer types, like billions, hundreds of new organizations popping up that are individual based as a surrounding person. I know so many friends people that have that created their own organization based only on their personal friends. What do you think this kind of shift towards, I guess, a more individualistic influencer type of network affect the ability to communicate? That's one big question. And second, I know that I'm very curious. Do you think intersectionality and increasing kind of that word trend on environmental movements are better because they allow them to have more things in common and to connect with other groups that are environmental? Or do you think it's affecting their ability to communicate with other more pragmatic? Like, do you think it's a net positive or negative for both?
Okay, so the questions are, I'll try to paraphrase them probably more simplistically than you asked them, but with this kind of shift towards influencer types of models of things and the rise of social media and so on, how has this affected the ability of organizations to influence climate policy and get messages out and shape things, and and what about intersectionality, especially within the movement? Is this a good thing for developing support for the movement's goals? I guess in terms of both of these things, what I'm kind of inclined to say is that that the environmental movement is actually quite diverse, and there's different actors doing different things, and actually that's for the most part a good thing. So I've been to, as probably other people have, I've been to a few COPs, and I'm actually heading to Dubai next Tuesday. And so some of the meetings I've been to, you see ENGO leaders inside the blue zone, talking to politicians and giving press conferences and involved in trying to influence negotiators and so on. And then, you see people outside shaking their fists saying, we should burn it all down and get rid of capitalism and so on. And to a certain extent, sometimes people talk about this as the difference between insider and outsider types of strategies. And often they come together in some ways. So people talk about the civil rights movement and the idea that, the existence of Malcolm X actually made it easier for Martin Luther King to have influence with politicians and stuff like that. So, so it's complicated, but I'm not sure that there's kind of one best approach. In terms of the intersectionality aspect of this, that is kind of a complex question. I mean, on the one hand, I do think that it's good that some environmental groups are working closely with other groups, indigenous groups and labor groups and, various types of social justice groups. I guess what my worry is a little bit is probably that, that we need as much of the sort of population as we can on board. And we don't necessarily want to alienate, say, centrist conservative environmentalists who might otherwise be on board for trying to get involved in action. So I think that's a tricky part of that question is one thing that I would say there. So I think there's a gentleman right below you that had a question.
Like I said, my takeaway is your research is focused on the Canadian federal policy.
Yes. Yeah.
So in Canada, certain provinces have a lot of climate policy that are at least as impactful, I guess, federal and even local government.
Yeah.
There research similar going on for those, say, provincial networks or local networks.
Yeah, so there is folks in the climate change policy network realm who are doing work at different levels. As as probably some people know better than I do, a lot of the sort of early advances in terms of climate policy was actually at subnational level. So, BC had a carbon tax before the rest of Canada did, and California and some other states had some measures before much of anything was done at the national level in the US, which still hasn't done very much. For the Canada case, we picked up a little bit of this in some of our discourse network analysis of media stuff. And so we talk a little bit about that, about action at different levels. My collaborator, Mark Stoddart, currently has a similar project, what I've described, focusing on, I forget exactly how he calls this, but the Atlantic provinces. So he's kind of working on the Atlantic provinces, and other people have done kind of similar types of things in cities or in regions or in provinces. So yeah, there's people working at those different levels. Yes. Yeah, so well, I can show you an example of this. So here, this is some screenshots of the questionnaire. So for some of it, what we did is just to make it a little bit easier, we had kind of a never category. This is for communication, but I think we also told them they could leave it blank and we would just consider it never if they left it blank. For the other 4 relationships, it's just whether or not they say they have a relationship. So if they don't answer, then the default answer is no. So they don't necessarily have to give 171 responses. And in fact, it's even more than 171 because it's 171 times 5. Yeah. I think there's a question in the back corner there.
For your presentation, it's been, I wondered about how like conceptualize the relationship between variables in your model. So like your models are set up to look at the effect of centrality on perceived influence. But I'm wondering like what you think about the idea of reversing those. So to me, I think like perceived influence might be something that might affect whether or not an organization is invited to provide scientific expertise or invited to communicate in certain situations. And so I guess I'm just curious to hear you think out loud a little bit about like what the directionality of those variables might be and like why that might matter for
Yeah, so that's a great question. You know, in terms of the particular study that we have here, because we have cross-sectional data, it's kind of hard to get a handle on that. Like I think for the most part the causal influence is from the networks to the influence, but that's just my assertion. But certainly people talk about this in the literature that, you know, one of the reasons there might be a correlation is because people will seek out people who they perceive to be influential to form a tie with, to talk with, or collaborate with, or whatever. So there's certainly that going on. Kind of more broadly speaking, the way that you would try to get a handle on that is by collecting longitudinal data. And so some of my colleagues are already working on this, and so they're collecting a second wave of data. I haven't got to that point yet. And there's some techniques in social network analysis that allow you to try to unpack that relationship. So there's this one sort of framework which is called Siena for looking at longitudinal social networks and trying to understand social network dynamics. And you know, I guess this is true in a variety of disciplines, but in social networks, you know, they refer to this as kind of the influence versus selection problem, and trying to undo that. But anyways, I guess the way you would deal with that would be collecting longitudinal data, and you know, here I can't be sure. So, Evelyn.
And how do you think if they see your data, they might become kind of classic repertory of collective or contested collective actions are not helpful, you know, that others kind of helpful more. And maybe the only possible way to be more exciting entering into the politics, or go to the same kind of big NGOs that are more influential to support into, or is there any other ways in which, you know, like the classical report or collective, you know, people on the street would be influential in some ways, like, I don't know, maybe covered on the media, or maybe some leaders are prominent and
yeah, so that's a big question. You know, I guess my answer is sort of similar to my answer to Fernando. Is probably a multi-pronged strategy is useful. You know, I guess that would be the main thing that I would say. One of the things that I have sort of thought about a little bit, which again people in this area don't sort of think about that much, is that you know, to a certain extent, we have actors or blocks that are kind of competing with one another to try to affect the outcome. But the people who participated in my study all participated voluntarily. So I always kind of feel this kind of qualm about, oh, well, what you should do is go and screw these people, and then you would have more, you know, have more of a chance of getting the outcome that you have. So I'm kind of a little bit reserved in terms of making prescriptions for what actors should do, given my role in collecting the data and having people voluntarily participate. That's kind of, that wasn't what you asked, but that was kind of a secondary thought that I had. So I think maybe you had a question, which maybe should be the last one or something.
Yeah, it came from the chat, but it was asking about, it came from Verena Rossell, who asked if industry representatives had similar concerns about privacy as other actors being named in the reports and publications.
Yes. In fact, I can think of somebody who is a representative of an oil and gas corporation who had pretty strong environmental sensitivities and didn't want to be quoted expressing those. Oh, Nick, do you want to ask a question? There was a variety of groups, but it was disproportionately environmental organizations, and that, at least for the sample, that came out of the sampling strategy. But we supplemented the targets with some other organizations as well. Yeah. Yeah, I'd have to think about that a little bit more. I'm not really sure off the top of my head, but I would say that in a certain sense, the more diverse the civil society category might become, the less clear the answers would be, because there's going to be diversity of positions in civil society if it was less NGO dominated, I think.
So we're all out of time, but thanks David again for the.
Thank you very much. Oh, and I should say, I have to rush off and go teach right now. So